question or two, and then we'll get to plenty from the audience. And you just mentioned that, you know, people out there, normal people, think that you, or Ron Paul, or Rand Paul, are pretty common sense. It's only in the political world that some of these ideas are strange. What kind of significant changes do you see taking place in the Republican Party and American politics right now, moving things in sort of a direction that people in this room would be interested in?
I think there's been a dramatic change, and it's another thing that I'll warn you guys about a little bit, is not to basically boot people out of the movement because they disagree with you on a couple things. Because we're going to have disagreements. People in this room are going to disagree with each other. I explain all my votes on Facebook. If you go to my Facebook page, you read my explanation. Once in a while, you're going to find one you disagree with. And that's normal. Sometimes we just have a different interpretation of the same principles. Sometimes you're wrong, sometimes I'm wrong. And that's okay. We're not going to be perfect in this. Sometimes it takes time to think through these ideas and how you apply them to legislation to get things right. So you've got to be willing to accept people without having them be 100% aligned with how you see everything. Sometimes people at home also, when they look at a bill, they might not know all the details of the bill that maybe a rep who reads the bill carefully would notice. But my point is, there are a lot of people out there in the Republican Party, so people tend to focus on me and Ron Paul and Rand Paul and Mike Lee and a few others, but there are others who are very close to what we believe in, who are very strong allies. I know a number of them. I can name some for you. Tom McClintock in California, Mick Mulvaney of South Carolina, Raul Labrador of Idaho. These are great guys. Are they going to agree with me 100% of the time? No. They're not going to agree with you 100% of the time. There may be times where we think, they're a little bit off on this or that, but these are allies, and we need people like this. Another person in the Senate, Senator Jim DeMint, a great ally, because he's willing to work with liberty-minded individuals within the party, and this movement is growing. There used to be only a few of us. I can tell you that it's growing and growing, and there's probably at least a dozen people I can count on in the House who at least have this on their minds when they go to vote. I have a liberty-oriented perspective on things, and are willing to listen to me, are willing to hear me out, and sometimes they're going to disagree, but are willing to work with us. And we got to keep growing that group. It's not going to be perfect. We got to grow that group from 12 to 25 to 50, and that's when we can have a real impact.
100, 200?
100, 200. I don't know if you'll ever get to 200, but as soon as you have a sizable number in Congress, when you have 50 people in the House who are willing to look at it from a pro-liberty perspective, pro-Constitution perspective, it starts to have a huge impact on the party. You can start to really influence negotiations and hold up bad legislation and help bring good legislation to the floor.
And that's how you build coalitions, is how you change policies and ideas. In the Republican Party in particular, people are starting to re-examine things like the Fourth Amendment. Your fight alone on the indefinite detention provision in the NDAA. Remind me of the conservative writer who basically said that Representative Justin Amash needs a lesson in what this means or whatnot. And you were absolutely right, and he was absolutely wrong. But this is one of those contradictions that, in George W. Bush's Republican Party, you would have been on the authoritarian side of things. Thanks to Representative Amash and Ron and Rand Paul, people could look at the more constitutional side of things. If you care to comment on that.
That's right. I mean, just generally speaking, when I go and speak about things like indefinite detention and the flaws of the NDAA and the indefinite detention policy under it, people are accepting those now as conservative positions. And that's really important, because 10 years ago, I don't think that would have been accepted as a conservative position. But now when I go back home and I speak to Tea Party groups, and when my colleagues come to me concerned about the NDAA vote, they're concerned because conservatives and libertarians are upset with them for having voted for the NDAA. That's where they're getting the pressure. It's coming from what has traditionally been the right. And that's different because for the past 20 years, most of those concerns have come from the left. And I think it's important that as conservatives or libertarians, I don't think it matters, frankly, which you call it, because my view is I'm trying to conserve the principles of the founding of this country, the principles that the founders believed in. So I think of that as conservative. And when you look at things like the Constitution and our founding documents, what are they concerned about? It's primarily concerned with civil liberties, protecting the rights of the people. So those are conservative ideas, and I want to bring that back into mainstream, and we've been doing that. That's a big change over the past few years.
With you explaining every vote you take on Facebook, how long do you think it's going to be before all of these other Capitol Hill leaders will be shamed into doing the exact same thing?
Well, I hope it starts to have an impact. If any of you aren't following me, it's facebook.com/Rep. Justin Amash. And I explain every single vote I take. I've done that since I was in the State House. I'm about a week behind right now, so I apologize. But I'm catching up on these vote explanations. And I think it's really important that we explain ourselves when we take votes, no matter how insignificant the vote seems to be. I think it's important that the public be aware of what we're doing. And actually, I hear from my colleagues all the time about this. They have constituents going to their town halls and their offices telling them, hey, I read Justin Amash's explanation on Facebook, and you didn't explain yourself, so can you explain why you voted the other way? And it's really starting to influence them. I have a number of colleagues who tell me every week, hey, after that vote, I went back home to see why I voted the way I did. I went to your Facebook page to find out why I voted the way I did. There was one colleague last week who said, because I'm a week behind in explaining myself, he said that he voted the same way as I did on a certain bill, and then he went to my Facebook page to figure out why he voted that way. But it wasn't there, so he was like really tripped up on how to explain it to people. And I apologize to him. So it's a service to my colleagues as well as to constituents. But I'm hopeful that over time more and more people have this kind of transparency and accountability. They don't have to do it through Facebook. Facebook's just, for me, it's a useful method to do it, but you could use any number of methods to explain yourself.
I think they're going to increasingly become more embarrassed that you're doing it and they're not, and constituents will let them hear about it. Let's go ahead and start taking some questions from the audience. You guys look pretty eager out there. We can take our first question.
Is it working?
I hope so. Is the mic working?
It's working about as well as mine.
Okay, are we good now? All right, fantastic. Okay, so Justin Amash, I wanted to preface by saying thank you for coming out, and truly you are an inspiration to not only myself but everybody in this room, and that you are the future of everyone. However, I do say I have a concern as an American Iranian. In the summer of 2009, it was the Green Movement in Iran. I was 15 years old. I just graduated high school. So this was before my sophomore year in high school. I was shot with tear gas, hit by a baton, and I was protesting on behalf of the Green Movement. Unfortunately, on December 20th, you voted for H.R. 2105, and that was the sanctions bill against Iran. Now, you said, quote, I do not believe that sanctions as a general matter are unconstitutional or unwarranted in particular circumstances. This was on your Facebook. And then when you asked about whether this contradicts the free market principles, you said, quote, this merits a much longer debate than I have time for here, unfortunately. My family in Iran, actually grocery prices in Iran increased by 70% in 2 months. And many people can't even buy their rice. Every person I speak to in Iran always blame that it's because of the Western sanctions that have been truly spearheaded by the United States. My question then is that whenever you see leaders such as Ron Paul and others within the Liberty Movement who say that sanctions are a precursor to war, or in the instance become an act of war because they hinder through force the free flow of commerce. My question then is that why did you support sanctions against Iran? And I know that you have a really good record of voting against them, but why was there an exception? And even then, why are you still open to the possibility of still voting for them?
Sure, that's an excellent question, and just to make clear, there were two sanctions bills. I voted no on one of them, which is the main sanctions bill. When people talk about the Iran sanctions bill, it's the other bill, the one I voted no on, that is the real sanctions bill. The one I voted yes on, now I don't remember all the details of it at this point, but that was a bill to prevent like weapons of mass destruction from being sent to Iran from like Russia and other countries. So it wasn't sanctions on Iran directly, it was on other countries who trade with them and other businesses that might trade with them. So I don't see it as, first of all, it's not unconstitutional to, I think, prevent to demand that other countries not trade arms with Iran. This is different from direct sanctions and some kind of like an embargo. For example, I would be opposed to an embargo that would prevent food and other supplies from getting to Iran. So I think when you have situations like this, you have to look at the details of the bill, and you have to think about what is reasonable and what is unreasonable. I always think that sanctions in the long run are not useful tools. I think they may be effective as a short-run tool to try to pressure a particular regime. But when that fails, I don't think it's a good long-run strategy. For example, what we've done in Cuba has been a disaster. It hasn't worked, and we should lift all the sanctions and embargo on Cuba.
So the other question I had about sanctions, however, was that, so do you not share the same opinion with Dr. Paul and others within the Liberty Movement?
Just to be clear, this is not going to be a debate. Everybody has a question, this is statement, just question.
Oh, yeah. My question then is just, do you share that same opinion, though, with Dr. Paul or others within the Liberty Movement that sanctions are an act of war?
I disagree with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't agree that sanctions are an act of war. They could be part of an act of war, yes, but I don't think sanctions themselves are an act of war. No. So, and again, you have to look at the different types of sanctions that might be levied. And when I voted for those particular sanctions, that's very different from the other Iranian sanctions, which are the main ones that people talk about. I voted no on that bill.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for coming here tonight. I really appreciate everything you do. I think you're really innovative in the way that you explain your votes on Facebook. And my question is in regards to that. How do you think that social media, as it becomes more and more involved in our lives, is going to affect both the Liberty Movement and the case of politics in general?
I think it's going to have a tremendous impact, and one of the great impacts it's going to have is it's going to start to break down the party system. 10, 20, 30 years ago, before you had social media, before you had the proliferation of information like we have now, people really needed parties to understand where the candidates were coming from. So candidates couldn't really reach everyone as easily as they do now. So the way you figured out what a candidate stood for was you determined, oh, that person's a Republican, or that person's a Democrat, or they're in the Libertarian Party. And it gave you an idea of where they stood. But at this point, we don't really need parties in that same way. Because when I vote on something, I can go right back to my constituents and explain to them why I voted the way I did. And I don't need the party to explain it for me. I don't need to be attached to the party in the same way that someone 20 or 30 years ago would need to be. I don't think someone doing what I'm doing could very easily be in office 20 or 30 years ago. Ron Paul got into office, which was extremely unusual. And that's why he was the lone person there fighting for liberty for so many years. It's because of how difficult it was to do what he was doing for so long. Now, with social media, I think it's a lot easier to be like me, and to be like Ron Paul, and to be like Rand Paul. It's easier to be independent and to do the right thing. So I think that's going to be the main impact, sort of allow